A few weeks later, in the royal palace hall, King Sejong sat in deep thought on his throne. One hand supported his chin, his mind filled with unanswered questions. He let out a slow sigh and muttered, "I haven't seen the Crown Prince much lately. Even yesterday afternoon, he was nowhere to be found. What could he be up to?" Suddenly, hurried footsteps echoed from outside. A eunuch entered and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, the Crown Prince has arrived." "Oh, let him in!" King Sejong commanded. The ministers began grumbling among themselves. "So much for our days of peace." The Crown Prince bowed and greeted his father. "I hope you've been well, father." King Sejong stared intently at his son. His voice was calm, but carried weight. "I rarely see you these days. What have you been working on?" The Crown Prince smiled. "I was just about to report the results of my recent research, father." A eunuch stepped forward and handed the Crown Prince a thick book. "This is the report on the achievements of the Institute for Scientific and Technological Development, Your Majesty." The king opened the book and began reading carefully. His brows furrowed as he examined the contents. After a while, he looked up and asked cautiously, "Is everything in this report true?" The Crown Prince replied calmly, "Yes, father." The king continued reading. His eyes widened in shock. He repeated his question, this time with a more serious tone. "So, you've really figured out how to adjust the Ming Dynasty calendar to better fit our nation's needs?" The Crown Prince remained composed and nodded. "Yes, father. Do you remember the incorrect timing of the solar eclipse ritual a few years ago? The prediction was off, and the ritual ended up starting 15 minutes late. As a result, the official responsible for the forecast was punished." The king slowly nodded. "Yes, I remember it well." The Crown Prince continued explaining. "The main reason that happened was because the Ming Dynasty calendar doesn't fully align with our own time system. That's why we needed to develop a formula that better suits our country." Resting his chin on his hand, the king read through the report more carefully. After a moment, he nodded. "This could be very useful. But there's something I'm curious about. What is this astronomical observation device you mentioned?" The Crown Prince explained. "As the name suggests, it's a device used to observe astronomical phenomena." The Minister of Finance, who had been listening in, mumbled under his breath, "That doesn't explain anything at all." The Crown Prince looked slightly disappointed but still smiled and said, "I'll submit a more detailed report later, Your Majesty." The king remained silent for a moment, then replied, "Very well then." He wanted to ask something else, but ultimately held back. In his heart, he thought, "This child. He's even considering our diplomatic ties with the Ming Dynasty." Finally, the king said, "Once this matter is settled, we'll discuss it further." "Understood, father," Hyang replied. A few days earlier, Hyang had already been thinking about this matter. He fully understood that observing celestial bodies could become a serious diplomatic issue between the Ming Dynasty and their own kingdom. That's why, in the report he submitted, he proposed not to create an independent calendar system. Instead, he suggested adjusting Joseon's lunar calendar based on the Ming Dynasty's methods. However, there was another important achievement included in the report, one that the Crown Prince deliberately chose not to mention out loud. King Sejong took notice of this and grew increasingly curious. He reopened the report his son had handed over, scanning the pages carefully. After a while, he looked up with a serious expression. "Crown Prince, I don't see any mention of military affairs in this report." Hyang paused for a moment before replying. "Research in the military field is being conducted under extremely strict confidentiality, Your Majesty." "That's why we need a bit more time," the ministers whispered among themselves. What exactly are they working on? But before anyone could ask further, the Crown Prince added something that made the king flare up. "Although we're a little behind schedule, we'd like to request additional funding, Your Majesty." King Sejong's face turned bright red. He clenched his fists, trying to contain his anger. "You insolent brat! You should show results first before asking for more money." Even as the king scolded him, Hyang remained silent, choosing to keep the matter secret. General Choi Haesan and Yi Cheon, who were also present, didn't say a single word. Everyone stayed quiet, despite the king and ministers pressuring them for answers. That night, King Sejong was still restless. He sat on his throne, staring blankly out the window. Should I wait until that boy submits his report? Or should I just go see him now? While he was still torn, a eunuch entered and bowed respectfully. "Your Majesty, the Crown Prince has arrived." The king immediately gave the order. "Let him in." As Hyang stepped inside, the king leaned forward slightly. This time, his voice was gentler. "Why are you visiting so late at night?" The Crown Prince lowered his head respectfully. "My apologies for coming at this hour, father. I don't have much to report right now, but I do have a request." The king raised an eyebrow. "A request?" Hyang nodded. "I need access to the officers and soldiers from the military training center." King Sejong replied, "Very well, permission granted." Hyang exclaimed, "Your generosity is boundless. Oh, by the way, father, we're starting to run out of funds, so if you could—" Before Hyang could even finish his sentence, King Sejong cut him off and snapped, "You little rascal, get out of here." A few days later, a number of officers and soldiers from the training unit were dispatched to the Science Research Institute. But what stood out was that even though they were there, none of them spoke a word about what was happening. Even more suspicious, the soldiers sent to the Institute were soon relocated to a different, heavily guarded site. The area was surrounded by tall fences and secured to the highest degree. One thing, however, couldn't be hidden. Explosions could be heard every single day from within. At the entrance, the Crown Prince posted a sign. It read, Area 51. Upon hearing the name Area 51, King Sejong grew curious and asked his ministers, Area 51? What does that mean? One minister shook his head. I don't know either, Your Majesty. But after the name was introduced, a new term began circulating among palace officials. Game changer. King Sejong squinted. Game changer? What does that mean? I'm not entirely sure either, Your Majesty, but I heard it's a term from the West. The king let out a long sigh. This child, he becomes harder to understand each day. Since Area 51 was established, the Crown Prince had become even busier. He woke up every morning at 6 or 7, completed his royal duties, and immediately headed to the Military Research Institute inside Area 51. His schedule was so packed that he began riding a horse just to save travel time. The sight of Hyang galloping through the city streets became a spectacle in itself. Two officials, watching from the roadside, whispered to each other, What exactly is the Crown Prince working on? Meanwhile, back in the palace, a minister bowed and said, Your Majesty, we can't wait any longer. We must investigate what the Crown Prince is doing. Another minister chimed in, He's right. We need to ensure the royal budget is being used properly. The king let out a quiet sigh. He lifted his gaze and asked, Do all the ministers feel this way? The ministers exchanged glances and nodded. King Sejong paused in thought before finally saying, I feel the same. Then, in a firm voice, he gave the order. Summon the Crown Prince. Immediately. One high-ranking official quickly responded, Yes, Your Majesty. A short while later, Hyang arrived before the king and bowed respectfully. You called for me, father? The king stared at him sharply. I know you've produced great results since last spring, but the ministers and I haven't received a single report since then. We want an update right away. Hyang remained composed. With a steady voice, he replied, Father, my apologies. But what I'm working on is tied directly to Joseon's national security. Because of that, I have no choice but to keep everything confidential until the results are ready. It's highly classified. The king narrowed his eyes at the Crown Prince. I understand this is a secret project, but without a proper report, I can't approve any more funding. Two ministers standing nearby glanced at each other. Is His Majesty really going to launch an investigation? King Sejong continued. That's why I'll be conducting an inspection of your work myself. Hyang swallowed hard. He knew time was running out. Seeing the nervous look on his son's face, the king finally said, Very well. I'll give you time to prepare. How long do you need? Hyang took a deep breath. He knew there was no choice but to face this head on. Please give me just 5 days. The king gave a firm nod. Fine. In 5 days, we'll inspect the Research Institute. 5 days later, all the ministers and palace officials gathered outside the Research Institute. When the king arrived, they all bowed in unison. The Crown Prince greeted him with enthusiasm. Father, you're here. The king nodded, his eyes scanning the area. It seems research here has progressed rapidly. I see there are more and more officials involved. But then he squinted suspiciously as something caught his eye. King Sejong asked, Why do they all look unwell? Or is that just my imagination? Hyang quickly replied, It's just your imagination, father. Now then, shall we head inside? Inside the building, the king looked over the various items on display. Isn't that something Minister Jang created? Why is it so small? The Crown Prince smiled faintly. That's just a miniature model for display, father. The actual items aren't functional yet. The king frowned. That's all? This doesn't match the budget that's already been spent. But Hyang let out a small chuckle and quickly walked toward a door at the side of the room. Before opening it, he turned back and said, Father, that was just the beginning. The real results are inside this room. King Sejong looked stunned. His curiosity was plain on his face, as his eyes swept across a series of strange-looking objects neatly arranged on long shelves. The king stepped deeper into the room and asked, What are all these? He was so eager that he couldn't wait to explore further, but Hyang gently tugged at his father's sleeve. Father, everything you're about to see is highly confidential. Aside from you and the ministers, no other officials are allowed inside. The king nodded and immediately gave the order. All other officials must remain outside. Yes, Your Majesty, they replied in unison. Only the king and the ministers were allowed in. The rest had to wait outside. Once inside, the king turned to the Crown Prince. So, you and the people at this institute created all of this? Hyang nodded eagerly. Yes, father. Everyone here has worked incredibly hard. The king gave a faint smile. I can see that. You've done remarkable work. He then picked up a long, unusual-looking tool. What is this long stick for? Hyang responded with enthusiasm. That's called an inclinometer. It's used to measure the balance between horizontal and vertical alignment. He added, If the iron ball inside rests right in the center, it means the surface is perfectly level. The king observed the tool carefully. I see. But why is such precision necessary? The Crown Prince smiled. For construction, father. King Sejong looked surprised. Construction? Explain further. Hyang nodded. When building astronomical instruments, the surface must be completely level to ensure accurate calculations. Without this tool, the measurements will always be off. King Sejong said, I understand. So we can use this for constructing walls and government offices too, right? I'm sorry, father, but it's still too early for that, Hyang replied. The king asked again, Why is that? This inclinometer is still in its demonstration phase. We'll submit a report once it's ready for practical everyday use. The king nodded in understanding. I see. I'll wait. As the king walked further into the room, a model ship caught his attention. He picked it up and examined it closely. Is this a warship? The Crown Prince beamed with pride. Yes, father. This is a scale model of the largest warship we're currently designing. King Sejong narrowed his eyes, carefully studying every detail of the model. So, you're not just working on measurement tools, you're designing warships too? The Crown Prince nodded. Yes, father, and this is just the beginning. The king looked at his son with an unreadable expression, but inside, he was beginning to feel that his son might truly be creating something extraordinary, and even more surprising. This was only the beginning. He turned his eyes back to the model in his hands, examining it with great interest. But this ship looks strange. It's not a Joseon design. The Crown Prince smiled. That's right, father. It's a Western-style ship. This model is built to scale based on their largest warships. The king's eyes widened. So Westerners have built ships this big? He then added, But where are the oars? How does it move? Hyang chuckled. This ship doesn't need oars, father. It moves entirely by wind power. The king slowly nodded, starting to grasp the concept. He picked up another model and asked, What about its weaponry? The Crown Prince responded with excitement. This ship uses cannons. If our calculations are correct, it can carry around 80 cannons. The ministers nearby looked shocked. 80 cannons? The king exclaimed. Incredible! Hyang looked at his father with pride. I promise I'll show it to you in action someday, father. The ministers were still in disbelief over what they had just heard. But then, the king's attention shifted to a simple-looking model placed next to the warship. He frowned. What is this? Why is there a bowl of noodles here? The Crown Prince couldn't hold back his laughter. No, father. That's not a noodle bowl. It's meant to represent a ship made of iron. Suddenly, the room went silent. The ministers were stunned. Then, all at once, they shouted, A ship made of iron? A few months earlier, the Crown Prince had expressed his desire to build an iron ship. At the time, the ministers responded with skepticism. Your Highness, that's impossible. Even a child knows that iron sinks in water. But Hyang simply smiled and replied, It's not impossible. We just haven't found the way yet. He then gave an order, Eunuch, bring me a bronze noodle bowl and a basin filled with water from the kitchen. The eunuch bowed respectfully and quickly carried out the order. Once everything was prepared, Hyang casually took the bronze bowl and placed it on the surface of the water. See? Even iron can float. The ministers were stunned, now curious to hear Hyang's explanation. He calmly continued. If an object is solid and has a small surface area in contact with the water, it will sink. But if we make it hollow and increase the surface area that touches the water, it can float. He added, the key is density. If we build an iron object with a large enough volume and make sure it's hollow inside, its density will be lower than water, and the iron ship will float. Jang Yongsil stroked his beard and nodded, showing he understood Hyang's point. Meanwhile, Yi Cheon looked confused by the term density. Before Hyang could explain, Minister Jung Cho cut in, I've heard of this at the Engineering Institute. If we use thin but strong iron plates and assemble them, we can build an iron ship. The Crown Prince nodded. Exactly, it's that simple. But how can we bind those iron plates together tightly without letting water leak in? Hyang gave a mysterious smile and said, That's your task. I'll leave that part of the research to all of you. The ministers nearly cried internally and thought, maybe it's time we retire. And that's the reason why there was a noodle bowl here. After the demonstration, the left state councillor finally spoke up in a worried tone. Your Majesty, I'm not so sure building an iron ship will be easy. Will we really be able to figure it out? The king turned to the Crown Prince. What do you think? Do you believe we can? Without hesitation, Hyang replied, Absolutely. We already understand the principles. We just have to find a way to apply them. But, Your Majesty, the problem is, we don't know how long it will take. The king fell silent for a moment, then finally asked, Will I be able to see this iron ship completed during my reign? Hyang paused before giving an honest answer. Perhaps not even I will see it completed during mine. The king was taken aback. Then why continue with this research, even when we have no idea how much time or money it will take? But the Crown Prince stood firm. With full conviction, he said, For the future of Joseon, we have to do this. Please trust me, father. The room fell silent again. The ministers and the king stared at the Crown Prince, speechless at his boldness. King Sejong murmured, This boy, he's reckless. But everything strange he's done so far has led to something amazing. The king let out a long sigh, then spoke with authority. Very well. Continue the research. The The Crown Prince smiled broadly. A major new step for Joseon's future had just begun. But we can't keep investing time and money blindly. You must prepare and submit detailed plans on a regular basis. Hyang replied, "As you command." The king was still examining the iron ship model when something odd caught his eye in the corner of the room. "I'm curious. What's that strange-looking object over there?" The Crown Prince turned and answered, "Oh, that's Heron's steam engine, father." The king frowned. "A steam engine? Like this?" Hyang nodded and explained, "It's a device invented long ago by a Western scholar." Suddenly, Jang Yongsil spoke up. "Even if we succeed in building an iron ship, there's another issue. The heavier the ship is, the harder it'll be to move using only sails and oars, right?" Minister Jung Cho added, "He's right, Your Majesty. That's another challenge we'll need to solve." But Hyang simply smiled with excitement. "Of course, I've already thought about that, and that's exactly why I want to begin a new research project with all of you." He then gave another order. "Eunuch, bring me the tool I requested from the armory, and also fetch a charcoal stove and a kettle of water." The eunuch bowed. "Yes, Your Highness." Not long after, the eunuch returned with the tools the Crown Prince had requested. Hyang quickly prepared the steam engine experiment, filling Heron's ball with water, setting it up, then heating it with charcoal. Seeing this, the ministers murmured in curiosity, "Water and fire? How could that possibly work?" Hyang responded calmly, "You'll find out soon enough." A few moments later, the iron ball began to spin. The ministers were astonished. "This thing spins like a wheel," said Jung Cho. "And it's gradually picking up speed," added Jang Yongsil. Hyang looked at them and asked, "Have you ever seen a pot lid move while rice is being cooked?" The ministers nodded. "The energy from steam and fire is strong enough to lift even a heavy lid. That's where this concept comes from. I call it a steam engine." The steam engine continued spinning, faster and faster, like a whirlwind. Jung Cho, the Minister of Public Works, observed it with deep interest. "Who would have thought, with just a bit of water and fire, this machine can spin like that? I think it's worth studying further." Jang Yongsil added, "If we can perfect it, I believe we could use it on ships. It'd be very practical. We wouldn't need to rely on the wind or large crews to row anymore." But Hyang waved his hand and said, "Not just for ships." Minister Yi Cheon's eyes widened. "What do you mean? What else would you use it for?" The Crown Prince smiled. "What if we used it to replace horses and pulling carts?" The ministers looked stunned. "This machine? Replacing horses?" The Minister of Public Works and the Minister of Finance exchanged glances, then looked back at Hyang, clearly in disbelief. "But is that even possible?" King Sejong looked unsure. "You want to use this machine to pull carts?" Hyang nodded. "Yes, father." King Sejong sighed and shook his head. "I don't understand. How would that even work?" The Crown Prince smiled calmly. "Which part doesn't make sense, father?" The king explained. "To run this machine, you'd need to constantly supply it with water and fire, right? That means you'd have to carry a lot of water and firewood. If that's the case, there wouldn't be enough room for cargo or passengers." Hearing that, Hyang thought to himself, as expected of father. Always sharp. Still, he kept a composed expression and answered, "I understand your concern, father. But this steam engine can generate far more power than its size suggests." He continued, "This machine isn't limited to pulling just one cart. It could pull many at the same time." The king still looked doubtful. "Multiple carts at once? Is that even possible?" But Hyang gave a confident smile. "Allow me to show you?" With great enthusiasm, Hyang headed to another room and opened a cabinet. As the king and his ministers stepped inside, they were all stunned. Hyang smiled with satisfaction at their reactions and murmured, "This is my dream, born from the spirit of the 21st century that I carry within me." In front of them stood a detailed model of a railway system. He then announced, "Allow me to demonstrate the power of this steam engine." With full confidence, the Crown Prince gave an order to the eunuch, "Prepare the locomotive." The king, growing increasingly curious, asked in confusion, "You attached the steam engine to wheels?" But before he could finish his question, Hyang had already lit the fire. Within seconds, the miniature locomotive let out a hiss. White steam billowed, and the wheels slowly began to turn, then faster and faster. The ministers held their breath. "It's moving on its own." The king could only watch wide-eyed as the tiny steam train moved steadily along the rails. The Crown Prince beamed and said, "This is still just a model, but we'll do everything we can to bring it to life. With this, we can connect the entire nation faster than ever before. If the research succeeds, we could reach destinations that once took days, in a single day." Then Hyang paused, shook his head slightly, and corrected himself. "No, we'll be able to travel from the southernmost point of Joseon to the farthest north in just one day. When that day comes, the frozen heartbeat of Joseon will begin to beat again." King Sejong whispered softly, "The frozen heartbeat of Joseon will beat again?" Hyang continued, "Looking at our current reality, the pulse of Joseon is frozen. Because of the high mountains, people remain bound to the land where they were born. They can't leave, they can't see the outside world, and in the end, they live stagnant lives until the day they die. That's why they've grown deaf to what's happening beyond their borders. Their lives flow on, unchanged. But if this locomotive can reach every corner of the land, then Joseon will finally understand the true meaning of bringing great benefit to the world of mankind. The right state councilor murmured, "This feels like a dream." The left state councilor could only stand speechless, stunned by the Crown Prince's vision. But King Sejong looked uncertain, his brow furrowed in thought. He muttered under his breath, nearly lost in his own mind. "There's no doubt this will cost a fortune." His sharp gaze shifted to Crown Prince Hyang, his eyes filled with serious contemplation. After a long pause, he finally spoke firmly. "I'll help you resolve the labor issue. But what about the funding? Have you considered how to finance this research?" Crown Prince Hyang nodded confidently. "Yes, Your Majesty. I've prepared an economic plan that can support the research without placing too much burden on the royal treasury." With conviction, he gave an order. "Minister of Public Works, please present the funding plan we've prepared." Minister Young Cho moved immediately. With practiced hands, he retrieved and laid out several thick books filled with financial documents. King Sejong eyed the growing stack with a frown. His eyes widened at the sheer volume before him. "What is this? A full-scale national development plan?" He let out a heavy sigh and grumbled, "At times like this, I truly despise the golden brush." But Hyang remained composed. With a voice full of determination, he explained, "This is a long-term strategy. This plan is designed to strengthen Joseon's economy by considering geography, economic conditions, population distribution, and the resources available to us." But King Sejong didn't respond right away. His eyes remained fixed on the stack of thick books, 42 of them in total. After a long pause, he took a deep breath and finally spoke in a calmer tone. "Still, this is worth a deeper look." He turned to the left state councilor and gave a command. "Review everything with the other ministers." "Yes, Your Majesty," the councilor replied respectfully. Suddenly, Hyang spoke again, but this time his voice was more serious. "Your Majesty, I have one very important request." King Sejong turned to his son, giving him his full attention. "What is it?" he asked. Hyang took a deep breath and spoke with concern. "At the moment, the research center is severely understaffed. Including myself, many officials are working without enough rest." The king turned his gaze to Young Cho, examining him closely. "Minister of Public Works, is this true?" Young Cho fell silent. His tired face grew even more somber, and before he could stop himself, tears began to fall down his cheeks. Choked with emotion, he finally spoke in a near-broken voice. "Your Majesty, we're working on more than one project at the same time. With so many tasks and so few people, we barely have time to rest." King Sejong narrowed his eyes. "Can't you recruit more officials to help?" Young Cho slowly shook his head. "Rumors about the overwhelming workload have already spread, Your Majesty. At first, some people applied after hearing there'd be promotions, but..." He paused to take a deep breath. "Every time a new official joins, the Crown Prince starts a new project." The room fell silent. Young Cho continued, his voice even softer now. "As Your Majesty knows, it's been over half a year since this research center was established, and in that time, we've accomplished more than anyone would think possible." King Sejong let out a long sigh, then gave a short snort. He looked at his son and muttered, "You little rascal." But then, unexpectedly, his expression brightened. A faint smile appeared on his lips. "Seems like you've been working pretty hard, huh?" he teased. Hyang gave a small, polite smile. "Your kindness is immeasurable, Your Majesty." The ministers, who had hoped to gain the king's sympathy, could only stay quiet. They had expected the king to take their side, but clearly that wasn't the case. And now, it seemed their workload might only get worse. King Sejong let out a soft sigh before speaking firmly. "All right, I'll support this project. We'll begin by allocating an initial budget and recruiting more skilled scientists and technicians." Hearing that, Crown Prince Hyang smiled brightly, his eyes shining with excitement. But before the euphoria could last, the king added, "This research will likely require a massive budget. That's why I believe this matter must be decided carefully, after thorough discussion." "I understand, Your Majesty." But before Hyang could finish, King Sejong quickly cut him off. "But it seems you haven't shown me everything yet." The smile on Hyang's face slowly faded, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. "I've already allocated a substantial budget for the research center. Surely, this can't be all you've achieved, right?" Beads of sweat began to form on Hyang's temple. Inwardly, he muttered, "As expected from father." With a faint, unreadable smile and a darkened expression, King Sejong asked, "Shouldn't we be taking a look at that place too?" His voice carried the weight of a command. "I'm talking about Area 51. There was no way to avoid it now. With a heavy heart, Hyang answered in a restrained voice, "As you command, Your Majesty." This video ends here, but the story isn't over yet. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next part.